Welcome, everyone. I am delighted that you are here. We are here to practice our First Amendment right to free speech. We are here because I think we all know that we need to use our free speech to uphold our values and principles so that we can strive to really reach a more fair and inclusive society. But we also need to use our free speech to call out hate speech, to call out racist speech, to call out bigoted speech, to call out those who use it as their agenda to provoke us and divide us. And I think that that's part of what free speech is about. And today I'm really delighted that the Southern Poverty Law Center is here to engage us in a discussion around that. So I will introduce our speaker right now. Ryan Lenz is the senior investigative, is a senior investigative writer for the Southern Poverty Law Center's Intelligence Project. For the past 7 years, he has traveled the country covering the rise of hate and extremism as it has moved from the margins to the mainstream of American life. Before joining the Southern Poverty Law Center in 2010, Ryan was a regional correspondent for the Associated Press, as well as an Iraq War correspondent for the Wire Service from 2005 to 2008. He is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, and I'm just really thrilled that he's here to engage us in this important discussion. So let's welcome Ryan, please.
Well, thank you for having me. First, I want to start with thanks to UC Berkeley, as well as the Division of Equity and Inclusion here at the university. And I want to thank all of you for coming to hear about this very important topic, including, as I suspect, people who are in the room who have political perspectives that are opposite of mine. Now, as someone who's covered this movement, this rise of the radical right for the better part of a decade now, I can say that I welcome everyone's presence here, and I'm glad to have you all here. And even if we disagree politically, there's no reason that we can't talk. So let me start with this image right here. This image was taken, I believe, at the second Berkeley rally that the alt-right had on campus. It was a guy who was walking around with a Make America with a MAGA hat and his mouth taped with Berkeley, assuming or presuming at least that Berkeley was censoring those who had political perspectives that were in discordance with what this university stands for, what this building stands for. And it was a moment, I think, that was incredibly pivotal for the rise of the alt-right in recent years. And it starts, I think, right here. It starts with Donald Trump winning the presidency. This moment was really the culmination of about 2 years. Well, if you really want to talk about it, it was the culmination of decades of efforts on the part of the radical right to take ideas that had been pushed to the fringe and to the shadows of American culture since the civil rights movement, and take these ideas and bring them back out of the shadows and put them into the mainstream of discussion. And for most of us, for at least those of us who stand for the values of inclusion, tolerance, acceptance for everybody, that which America ultimately is about, Election Day had a certain sort of meaning for us. It was a sad day in some respects, because what it said to us, what it spelled out, was that these ideas of bigotry, hate, extremism, intolerance, had moved into the mainstream in a way that we did not expect. We did not really anticipate them to arrive in the halls of power, so to speak. But not everybody was as upset or as confused by what had happened. In fact, there was a good number of people who felt that the election of Donald Trump was a boon for pushing back the forces of quote-unquote multiculturalism, pushing back progressive advances that had been moving steadily, I guess, to advance in our country for at least during the 8 years of the Obama administration. Now that period, the 8 years of the Obama administration, can't be discounted for what they did for the rise of the alt-right, for the rise of the radical right now calling itself the alt-right. For 8 years, beginning in 2008 with his election, and then moving into 2009, we saw pretty much a steady and meteoric rise in the number of hate groups across this country. Every year, we calculate the number of hate groups across the country. We spend a year surveying the political landscape, publications, websites, and so on to have an understanding of exactly where hate and extremism existed or exists for the purposes of understanding just how thoroughly, how far and wide these ideas have infiltrated culture and society. The reason for the hate group count is to understand where these ideas exist, who are the purveyors of these ideas, and what should we know about them. So last year, we counted 917 hate groups across this country. It was down from an all-time high of just over 1,200 in 2009, but still a pretty daunting picture of what organized hate looks like in America. But the reason for the rise ultimately had to do with, as I said a moment ago, with President Obama. You know, the idea that we had elected our first African-American president scared and terrified a lot of people. It said to them that the institutionalized reality of white supremacy or white power or white whatever was under threat. And there were other reasons that they would fear this way. In 1970, 83% of the American population was white, and only 17% was non-white. If we go to today, that number is shrinking. Now, what this spells out to someone who has a vested interest in maintaining white supremacy or white interests, either through the voting bloc, through public policy, through federal government and others, is that means that the voting bloc is shrinking. That means that for those who have a vested interest in maintaining white supremacy, that the election process may not work for them in the future. So let's go back to the alt-right for a second. So the alt-right is a complicated thing, because what it ultimately is a rebranding of white supremacy for a digital age. And I know that sounds like a catchphrase, and we say it a lot at the Southern Poverty Law Center, but what that means is it's a way to throw away the baggage of what white supremacy spells. You know, it's not so politically palatable anymore to stand out and scream white power, but if you stand out and scream white genocide, or white oppression, or whatever you might say, there's a little bit of teeth to it, at least in the political world right now. Alt-right, as a phrase, was coined by a guy named Paul Gottfried, a white supremacist, and popularized by a man, Richard Spencer, who I'm going to talk about here in a few minutes. But it came at a time when we saw the dissolve, ultimately, of what news media stood for, and the arrival of people who were willing to take the interests of the alt-right into the deepest halls of power. People like Steve Bannon, who was until very recently a chief strategist for the White House and for Donald Trump. Steve Bannon said that Breitbart News was the media arm of the alt-right. Now, for those of us who monitor hate and extremism in the country, who have seen it move from the real world into cyberspace, have seen the methods and means of communicating the ideas of what white supremacy, hate, and extremism stand for, move online, Steve Bannon's critical. Because websites like Breitbart have done quite a lot to advance the causes of white supremacy and white nationalism. So that brings us to this week, and the reason that y'all invited me to come here. Okay, we're looking at Free Speech Week here at Berkeley, and this is an issue that has become incredibly advantageous for those on the alt-right who are seeking to basically have a strategic win. We're looking at, let me step back for a second. Berkeley has become the front lines in the alt-right's efforts to cast itself as a victim or as a silenced majority in this country. This movement has focused on your campus in a way that they've not focused on any other campus. And they've focused on a lot of campuses. We've counted more than 250 campuses across the country that have been flyered with messages of heritage, not hate, and things like this. But Berkeley has stood apart from the rest. Why? Because Berkeley is where they came to have a fight. And a fight was given to them here in a way that ultimately, I think, energized this movement even more. But it's not by accident that even that they've targeted college campuses. It's not by accident that they've targeted Berkeley. And I'm going to focus on this one man. Everybody knows who this is, right? It's Richard Spencer. He's the president of the National Policy Institute. He runs a website called Alt-Right and claims to have coined the phrase. He is a graduate of the University of Chicago and Duke University, and he's quite a smart man who has taken it as his own purpose to bring the alt-right fight to the streets in places like Berkeley. And and don't take my words for it, just take his words alone. He said that Berkeley, he only needs to say that one word and everyone knows what he's talking about. It has become the battlefield for all these forces that are part of the intensification and polarization of American politics, the fragmentation of a nation. And this is where we basically tie the alt-right into the political, I guess, the political direction this country seems to have taken in the last 8 years. And again, to return to my point, we cannot underestimate just what the reality of having an African-American president did to this country. People in what the coasts call flyover, what I call home, people talk about what happened during this election. Are 58 million people racists? No, we can't say that. But there were 58 million people who voted for Donald Trump who felt that something had changed in this country over the previous 8 years. Too many progressive policies had been put in place. Too much inclusion was granted. Too much equality was given to the LGBT community and others, that something had to be done about it. They felt disillusioned. They felt like someone else was being championed, and no longer were they the inheritors of the United States, as they claim to be. So if you talk about, let me step back for a second, if you talk about Spencer's entire idea, and I think he's just one part of what the alt-right ultimately represents, because it's a very complicated and nuanced constellation of ideologies that have all fallen in together under this banner to maintain some element of political palatability. But Spencer understood that if he could tell white kids, get into college kids, and tell them that, listen, you don't have to be a member of a safe space, because it doesn't pay attention to you. Safe spaces are not for white people, he says. Whites deserve their own space. And he's argued this point quite effectively, I think, for a lot of people. But the problem of the alt-right focusing on campuses like Berkeley is that it brings with it all of the challenges of what these ideologies ultimately represent. Because as I've said 1,000 times, and I'll say it again, even with confrontation, it is not a matter of when or if these ideologies turn violent. It's a matter of when they turn violent. And I say this because we've studied it. In 2015, we looked at the number of ideologically motivated attacks from the radical right over the course of a 5-year period, beginning in 2009. The period was not sort of accidental. We looked at this because it was a period of time that the federal government said that domestic terrorists or a threat of ideologically motivated violence from homegrown Americans was far less important than what we stood to worry about from, say, Islamic extremists or radical Islam or whatever they want to call it. And so they stopped looking at it for that 5-year period. But we studied it, and what we found was that every 34 days, every month, there is an attack either carried out or thwarted by someone who is driven by a far-right ideology. This can be anti-black, anti-immigrant, it can be anti-LGBT, anti-government. It doesn't so much matter what it is. What it matters is that they have this compelling drive that they are at that this battle is being lost and the fight needs to be brought to whomever. And we see that in the streets of Berkeley. We see that in the streets of Washington State. We see this in college campuses. We see this in Charlottesville, where no longer is it just a debate about varying positions on immigration or what the United States is supposed to be. We see this in places where increasingly the alt-right or the radical right is finding itself at wit's end about what to do and choosing violence as the only option to carry their way forward. Now, I want to point this out because we'll get back to it a little bit. This is also a moment, I think, where we should talk about Berkeley, what's happened here ultimately, because Berkeley has a large presence of what we call the Antifa, the anti-fascist movement. The anti-fascist movement is prone to violence as well. We have to say that. And it's violence that we should all condemn. We should not stand there and approve of brawls in the streets. And I'll say this as sort of an anecdotal story. We work at the Southern Poverty Law Center, and some of my colleagues are here right now. And every day we go to work and just go about the business of doing what we're doing in Montgomery, which is not really that exciting of a town. I'm sure you probably all imagine that to be true. But we look down from our building, and we see Martin Luther King's first church, the church that he worked in before moving away. It was the first church he had after seminary. And it's a reminder to all of us that, yes, this is a horrible movement that we're witnessing the rise of. And we need to do and say something. And we have First Amendment privileges to say something, just as the alt-right does too. The alt-right claims that we're trying to censor them or quiet them, but in reality we are not. We're just making sure that they know that hate speech, yes, it's protected, but it has consequences. As I said, these ideologies turn violent, and it's not a matter of if, it's when. So, let's go back to Spencer and why he's sort of spearheaded this effort to focus on college campuses. And for those students in the room, you should know that there is as Alex Jones says, if you know who he is, he runs a website called InfoWars, there is a war on for your minds. And Richard Spencer knows this. He's trying to recruit you, and many others are as well. And he said it as much. He said, people in college are at this point in their lives where they're actually open to alternative perspectives for better or worse. I think rewiring the neurons of someone over 50 is effectively impossible. He told Mother Jones that. Now, I'll tell you about one of my experiences here. I mean, it was amazing to me to see kids who are 22, 23 years old saying things that I never thought possible, to come out of the mouth of a 22-year-old, for that matter. Or look at Charlottesville or University of Virginia, where you have 400 students marching through campus screaming, "Jews will not replace us." I mean, how do those ideas infiltrate student bodies of people who are young and willing and open to all sorts of ideas, but should not be open to ideas that are the darker sort of demons of our history? After the Civil Rights Movement, these ideas had been pushed so far into the shadows, even though they fought continually to come out, that it just doesn't make any sense to me. But Spencer understood this. And that leaves us where we are right now. We are at a moment, I think, in time where the culture war is manifesting in the streets of America and on college campuses in a very real way. Some people call it a passive war or a nonlinear war, but there is a war happening. It is a conflict over ideas, and it's increasingly turning violent. This man right here, this man is James Fitzgerald. He's the man who drove the car into the protesters at Charlottesville. He is representing in that picture a student group called American Vanguard. It's a shield that they brought. These groups are coming into your campuses for the purpose of creating conflict, creating disagreement, creating a sense of an embattled minority that is trying to get a word out. They're claiming to be censored, but they are not censored. They are simply not, there's no one saying they cannot say these things. They're just saying we don't want them to be said here. There's his mugshot right there. When we talk about college campuses, we should recognize that we're talking about something much larger as well. The college campuses are basically the ground level of a conflict that is reaching all the way to the highest levels of federal authority and federal policy right now, and we see it repeatedly, with President Trump. President Trump, I should say this: the Southern Poverty Law Center is a nonpartisan organization, but we do recognize that for the better part of 2 decades, we've seen hate migrate pretty steadily from the margins into the mainstream. And with this election, I think we've seen a major movement of these ideas into the halls of power where policy will be affected by them for years to come. And that makes our role, or those of us who live on college campuses or study at them, that makes our role that much more important to push these ideas of inclusion, to push these ideas of progressive realities in the future we want for America. But there are ways to do it, and there are ways not to do it. And I'm going to we'll talk for a little bit about this. Does anybody know who these people are? Probably not. These are black bloc anti-fascist protesters. And these are effectively people who are going into the streets, screaming down white supremacists, alt-right actors, and doing so in some pretty ugly ways. It's violence that I think we all should condemn. We all should condemn this violence because they are not representative, I believe, of what we all hope America to be. An inclusive place, an understanding place, a welcoming place for anyone. I kind of rushed through this, so I'm going to shut it down right there, and we will have some questions, and then hopefully have a long discussion about this.